Hello and welcome to Mississippi Family Homestead on our nightly live stream about homesteading. And we want to thank you for joining us. And if this is your first time to see it, we're starting this live stream to talk about homesteading for people that want to, maybe start a homestead. You're interested in it and want to learn a little more about it. That's what this live stream is going to be for. So, hope we can help you out and help you learn something um, from this. So tonight we are talking about 12 questions, probably the 12 most asked questions about homesteading. We've kind of combed through the comments and looked at it to see what you may be interested in and want to answer some of those questions tonight. So
Yep.
if you're
So so if you're interested in homesteading, you need to ask yourself these questions. So one of the top one would be, why do you want to homestead? So you want to ask yourself that question if you're planning on starting a homestead. Ask yourself, why do you want to homestead? Do you want to grow your own food, be more independent, quit your full-time job, work on the homestead? Are you retiring? Do you want to just, try to get out of debt by living simpler? I know for us, it's helping some to be able to live a little simpler to get out of some of that debt. So that would be a reason. Do you just want, maybe a slower, quieter life to live, out in the country instead of in a busy city or in a suburb where you've got people around you? Maybe you just want to, live a quieter life, grow your own food, be healthier, because obviously if you're growing your own food, then that does make you healthier. So, that's some of the questions that we kind of asked ourselves and kind of, went for was some of those questions. Maybe you want to just learn some new skills and some responsibility, So those are some main things that as to why you want to. So that's the question. You want to ask yourself, why do
Yeah,
you
that's
want to?
right. And let us know in the comments, even if you're watching this on the replay, what is your reason for homesteading? Why are you interested in homesteading? Is, like she said, maybe you want to simplify your life. Now, another question you want to ask is, how much land do you need? That's probably one of the biggest decisions. And we kind of lucked out in this. We're on family land and we do have about 50 acres. You don't need 50 acres to homestead. And remember, when you're looking at land, one way to decide on how much land to get is decide your long range plans. Do you want to raise cattle? Which, if you do, that is a job in itself. Do you want to raise pigs or just maybe some chickens? That's going to decide on how much land you're going to really need on homesteading. So that's one of the big questions. Probably one of the most important questions is, how much land do you need? So think about that. Think about your long term plans and what you want to put on that land and what your goals are. So decide how much land you're going to need. That's one of your biggest questions.
So, and also with that land, it's more maintenance. The more land you
Right.
have, the more maintenance you have to have. And if you're buying the land, you got to have the money to pay for that land. So that's some important questions to ask
And
also.
also, if you have a lot of land, in order to maintain that land, like one of the expenses is you may end up needing a tractor, or you may need to, pay somebody to, if you need to bush hog the land or something like that. So that's one big thing to think about.
Hmm. So another thing, you'll want to think about the local zoning. Some states are really strict. Some counties are really strict about the zoning laws. If you're just wanting a small homestead and you have a few acres, if you're in an HOA, they won't allow you to have different pets sometimes, even chickens. So you want to think about those different zoning laws. Just keep that in mind. They won't let you raise those chickens or those bees or those goats in those certain zones. Here in Mississippi, we're pretty lucky. Out where we live in our county, they don't really have a whole lot of zoning laws out here. We just pay our land taxes and
Right.
don't really have to do anything for that zoning. But it may be a different story in your state or your county.
And there are some states I've seen where people will, I think they've built, maybe gotten a storage shed to live in or tiny house and found out later in that county they couldn't because there's a minimum square footage or something like that. So before you purchase any land, you need to always check to see what you can do with that land because that is one thing you hear about people that really holds them back is
Mm-hmm.
the restrictions of that. So, you really don't want to get into that. So do your research. If you can ask your realtor and, I would double and triple check everything before I would buy any land
Right.
on there. So,
Yeah, and sometimes I've heard of people being, they don't have a pathway to their land. You don't have a way
right.
to get
So
to
road
it's
frontage.
landlocked, so you'd have to, have a permit to do that. If you needed to go through somebody else's land, that could be a problem. So,
Right. You do need to make sure you have a road to the land. I
hmm
know all of us want to be, or a lot of us want to be kind of secluded, but you also want to make sure you can get in and out,
hmm
maybe some places
efficiently.
up north, you want to make sure you can get in and out on, if it's iced up or, something like that. So you
hmm
need some good roads to get in too.
That's right.
Another thing to look at is your budget. And I think this is probably one of the probably the most important thing, and the biggest asked question you know, is what budget do I need? And you need to really sit down and do your homework. I like to do spreadsheets and, lay out all the expenses. It's, if you, that's when you're selecting land, you got this, it has to do with your budget because the, all of this, all of the maintenance, you may can afford to get it up front, but you want to make sure you can maintain it good by doing that budget. Like for instance, if you're going to do a garden,
hmm
you don't want to do too big a garden because you've, if you're going to have a year's worth of food, you also have to have a year's worth to storage in.
Yeah.
So, do you have a place like a freezer already, or do you have the budget to get a freezer? And, that costs a little bit more electricity, probably not much, but you want to keep that in mind on when you're doing a garden. Chickens, a big thing is, as you well know, the chickens do cost a little bit to keep. They cost, you do have to pay for the food and
Right.
pay for the
And
expenses.
but you also want to make sure that you do that cost up front, that you do, build a good chicken pen or put up those good fences. You're going to have the budget to do that, because if you don't, later on, in life, things deteriorate. And if you don't spend that money up front for something good, then, it'll affect you later on in life. So just make sure that you budget out for those things. If you're going to buy cattle, you got to budget out for that. I know my grandpa, he just kind of got a few cows to begin with and a bull, and then he raised his cattle from there. So that's one good thing you could think about too. If you're gonna start raising cattle, to just start with a few maybe, and then the stock will build up as you go. For chickens or any livestock like that, you can build that stock up, and you won't have to get a whole herd of cattle to begin with. As over the years you can build it up. So
And
that's
when you're getting that cattle, remember you're going to have to keep that fence maintained, some kind of barn, some kind of shelter,
mm-hmm.
and the feeding trough. All those little things add up. So you want to put that in your budget, and then if you're going to do a garden, you want to make sure are you going to have to bring in any soil? Is the soil okay where you are? And another thing that you're going to have to look at when you're doing your budget, are you planning on doing all this work yourself? Do you have a full-time job? Do you have time to do it? Like if you're going to be building a tiny house or a cabin or something to live on that land, and do you, or you're going to have to clear a place for garden. So you might have to budget for that kind of stuff, to have, if you're not sure, don't go out and buy a tractor. You could maybe pay somebody to come, you know,
Clear the
clear it
land.
off. It
Yeah,
may be more
first.
efficient to do that at
Yeah.
first and make sure that that's what you want. So budget is one of the big things to look out for in homesteading.
And then another thing is how much time do you actually have? So whatever you're doing on that homestead, you're going to need time to do it. If you're having a garden takes time. You have to keep the garden watered. In the summertime, that's a big thing for us here in Mississippi. That garden has to stay watered. You're going to have to take the time to do that. You have to take the time to plant all of those seeds, kind of keep your garden maintained. You don't need a whole lot of weeds and stuff growing in there, so you'll have to, get all those weeds out. If you're taking care of chickens, they do require cleaning. You have to clean their coop out at least, twice a month. And you have to feed those chickens, water them, every day. So that takes time. So, if you have a full-time job and you're thinking about starting a homestead, then, just keep those things in mind. You're not going to be able to do, a full herd of cattle and chickens and a garden without, coming to an end there. That's hard to do.
Right.
So,
And talking about like a garden, if you have a big garden, ours is normally pretty big, and honestly, we get behind every year in the weeds because it just gets overgrown. And
yeah, and we do have full-time jobs, so that
right.
doesn't help our situation, with our time management on that. We do get behind every year. So
Yeah, so we're definitely not perfect. We do get way behind on that. But something else you want to look at is, what do you actually want to grow? What do you want to grow in your garden? Also, what do you want to raise as far as animals? We touched on that a little bit earlier, but what do you want to grow in the garden? If you really
if you don't like green beans, you don't want to grow
Right.
green beans, unless you're planning on trying to sell them or something. You want to grow the things that you want, that you're actually going to eat, and not grow the things that you're not going to eat. Some people, love corn, and you may want to grow a bunch of corn, but if you don't like corn, you don't want to grow that. Chickens, if you're not, you don't need a whole lot of chickens. If you just have a small family, you don't need a whole flock of, chickens, unless you're just like me, because I have a chicken addiction. I guess that's what my problem is.
I don't know. That's one of your problems, I think.
Yeah. So
And the problem with the chicken addiction, you would think we would have a ton of eggs, but we don't. We're having a shortage right now.
yes, we are. So
but yeah, you really want to think about what you want to grow. And I also think of it this way too, like there are certain things that are easier to put up. Corn you can put up in the freezer, peas you can, and think about those things. Tomatoes, you really, I guess you could make soup out of them.
You can make soup out of them. You can freeze them, but you would have to kind of cook them a little bit first. It's not the same as having a fresh tomato in the wintertime, if it's frozen, as it is in the summertime. So when you're growing, that's tomatoes, you don't want to grow more than what you can eat, especially during the summer, unless you're just going to make a whole bunch of soup, or, just put all those tomatoes up to use in a recipe.
Yeah, you're just making a lot of work for yourself if you're not going to use those. But now, if you can put those up,
that's great. Yeah,
you probably want to set a goal to be. Most of us, want to set the goal to be more self-sufficient, and but you don't need to do that the first year.
I don't
you'll
suggest
burn out
it
real quick.
Yeah. Now butter beans are real easy if you want to can them or freeze them. So are peas. You can can them or freeze them fairly easy. So those are some other things that are easy. Now the potatoes, if you're growing potatoes, just keep in mind those are kind of hard to keep in the wintertime. You need a special place for potatoes in the winter.
Cold, dark place.
Yes. If you're going to keep those potatoes where it can't be like a lot of moisture there either, or they'll rot. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to grow potatoes, you got to have a way to store those potatoes. You can can potatoes. To me, they're just better if they're fresher. I don't really like, the taste of a canned potato. I'd rather have them, fresh, and cooked.
Yeah.
So that's some things to think about.
Yeah. So definitely think about what you want to raise and grow on your homestead. So, and again, don't think you like we're talking about cattle and all that. You don't need to think that, hey, I have to have a lot of land, because you don't have to raise cattle.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't. We might one day, but that's something I really think I need to learn a lot more about before we dive into that. I think.
Which brings to the other question. The thing that you need to ask yourself is, what kind of skills do you need to learn? I mean, you are going to have to research, and if you've never had a garden before, you do need to research that to know how to plant those seeds and make them grow. What fertilizers do they need? You have to look that up and learn about it. Raising chickens is kind of hard sometimes. They die or predators get them. You need to kind of research that a little bit if you're going to get chickens. Larger, things like cattle, or if you're going to get a horse, for your land just because you want one, those animals need a lot of care and upkeep, and you've got to learn about that. You want to, if you're going to, start a homestead, make sure that you learn about what you're wanting to do on your homestead before you do it, or, it can fail.
Right. And another thing to think about is, do you have the support from your family? If your spouse is not into this, it's probably going to be hard to make it work. You have to all be on the same team for this to work. So, you got to talk about it. And then, are your kids old enough? And, are they going to be able to help do some of the extra work? And personally, I think it's great to get kids out in the garden and help, because I think that's one thing that today's society is missing, because we don't know where our food comes from anymore.
Right.
And, it is, if you could get everybody on board, I really think it is so, I mean, when we were growing up, I grew up in the city, but I did go to the country with my grandparents and got out there in the garden, and we worked, and, it was the best food ever because it was fresh food. And you kind of grew up on garden food.
I did. I grew up on garden food.
And it wasn't all this processed junk we have now.
No, it wasn't. And, the corn and the tomatoes and all of that, they went into the freezer, and you used all of that, during the wintertime too, as well in the summer. But we always had fresh vegetables to eat.
And they made us work when even at the grandparents' house, or I did, we had to get out work, pick the butter beans, and and actually we wanted to work.
That's
we
right.
wanted, but I think it's good to think about that and get the kids out there to learn about where your food comes from. If you're raising chickens, they can help do the pen. But you have to think about, is your spouse supportive of that? And then
now you can. I mean, if you're, I mean, I've seen single people do a homestead before.
Absolutely.
But you have limitations,
But you don't want to do it singly if your spouse is
right.
not
But
on board.
I mean, we're not saying that you can't do it alone, because plenty of people do. But it's just, you're restricted, by how much you can do usually if you're alone and by yourself. But you don't want to do it without your spouse's support.
But now, if your spouse is okay with you moving to the homestead, and maybe they doing the garden may not be their thing, you can still do a garden yourself.
Right.
So we're not saying total, but make sure everybody is in agreement with what you're doing. So
Yeah.
at least, but you might want to do a garden by yourself. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But, just make sure everybody's supportive, and get into the communities. There's so many communities on YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else that you can get into. And I mean, there's just unlimited ways to learn how to do all this stuff. So make sure you get on that.
Yeah. So, another thing that you want to think about is your climate. And again, you got to do your research and learn about your climate. There's certain crops that don't grow in Minnesota that grow in Mississippi. So, you want to think about that. And you'll have a shorter growing season, up north than you would in the south. Some, states only have like 6 months or less of a growing season. So you'll want to grow crops that grow faster than, you would say down in the south. So you want to think about that. And also in your climate, if you're raising those chickens and you're way up north, they're going to need a little bit better protection than they would down here in Mississippi.
Right. So yeah, the climate, and when you're looking for land, that's another thing to look for, especially if you're open to moving to another state. If you can't take a lot of heat, then don't move to Mississippi in the southern states. You may want to be up north. And the opposite is, if you can't take a lot of cold weather, you don't want to be up north.
Right. And you got to think about your rain, how much rain those states get. You want to think about, if it's hot, all those animals need a lot extra water and to be fed, in the summertime. So you just want to think about those things. Think about your climate.
And so, like, if you're in a real icy winter, you got to keep those animals going through the winter season. So it's really a lot more work than it is down here in the South, because we don't have as much winter time. But
that's right.
Another thing to ask yourself is, can you handle the hard part? And what we're talking about here is, like, you're going to have to, if you have a garden, you're going to have to get out in the 100-degree temperature and work, which smart thing is probably get out there early in the morning, maybe before you go to work, or late in the evening. But still, it's going to be, I know for us, we get out there and we're sore, but you know what? We think you got the feeling that you accomplished something.
That's right.
And when you're eating that food, it's out of the garden, it's so good. And another thing that, can you handle it? And this is probably a hard thing to handle if you're living on a homestead with animals. And no matter what, the animals can get sick. You get attached to them and they die, or predators get them, and something happens to them. There was, just over the weekend, we had this white pigeon that showed up with a yellow tag, and we were trying to figure out who it belongs to.
And if we could catch it, I was even thinking about going and getting like a net to catch it with. So, we kept thinking about that. It was just
and it was hanging out with the freelance chickens outside.
Yeah, the free range.
Free range, freelance. they're free range
chickens.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of business chickens. But
yeah, well, they're freelance, all right. Yeah. So the little pigeon was just hanging out with the chickens and walking around with them. And I tried to catch it one day, and we saw that it had a yellow tag on. An orange tag, wasn't it? It had an orange tag. An orange tag on one foot and a gray tag on the other. So we tried to, I tried to catch it, but it wouldn't let me catch it. And I was thinking, well, I need to go get a net, because I thought, well, I can catch it and we can look at the tag, see who it belongs to. Maybe I can put it in with the chickens, till we can figure out who it belongs to. And before we could do that, an owl actually caught that.
Yeah, Sunday an owl got it, and it's really sad, because it actually looked like it was having a good time.
I know, it was hanging out with the chickens.
Yeah, it was eating the chicken food, having a good time, and sadly, something got it. We've also had predators in the chicken coop. Something got our really good rooster. Which you wasn't too sad about.
No,
that.
I wasn't sad about that. I didn't really like the rooster.
We were sad, but and you got to get used to that. And I don't know, you may never get used to it, but that's the sad thing, is these animals, things happen to them, and they do die, and you do get sad about it. So that's just human nature. Another thing is, you spend all this time on a garden, and the garden is kind of like going to the casino. Sometimes it works out,
That's
sometimes it
That's
doesn't.
right. That's right.
You know,
If there's
most of the time you do get something out of the garden, but you can work that garden up and then it doesn't get any rain or you get too much rain.
yeah, yeah.
That but that's part of it. That's something you have to learn to be able to take is
Now, one thing that would help on a garden if you have a raised bed, I think that those help a whole lot, instead of
yeah.
just a regular garden. Especially, if you have a whole bunch of rain, you have more drainage, so it drains out a little bit better. So that's one other thing you might want to think about too is having a raised garden bed
Right.
for your crops, and it wouldn't be quite as much work. It's a lot of work if you're having a huge garden, and you kind of it's a lot of bending, a lot of physical work to have.
So
a
if
huge
you're
garden.
not into physical work, it may not be for you. But if you're now here's something else, and I'm trying to get better in shape, but you can look at it as an advantage. You can to help you get in shape, but
Right.
you will have to do on a homestead. You're going to have to do some physical labor because none of this just happens, as you well know. It just all this. When we moved to this land about 5 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I think about 5 years ago or more, it was nothing but trees, and most of it we did by hand. When we
With a
first
small
moved
tractor,
here, with a
yeah.
very small tractor, and it wasn't even a tractor with a front end loader, so we had to do
A lot of
most of
physical.
the cutting the trees.
Yeah.
We do have other tractors now, but when we first we moved out here, we didn't have
Anything, yeah.
anything. We got a chainsaw and just did a little bit at a time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was walking around the other day thinking, we have gotten a lot done, but we did a little at a time. And it's going to be exhausting. The physical work, in most cases, is good for people, and it is rewarding. So you've got to be prepared, and you got to if you're thinking about, do I really want to do this, think about, can you handle the hard parts like that.
Yeah. And the next thing that you want to think about is, what is your plans for your homestead? Do you want to make money off of your homestead, or is it just for your family to live on? So that's a good thing to think about. If you're trying to sell something on your homestead, you might want to start out with the whole, if you want to have cows and sell them for meat or for whatever, you can do that, but just think again, you got to think about that cost to up front. And then if you want to sell them, if you're selling stuff out of the garden, then you're going to have to grow, have a bigger garden or grow more things to sell. But if it's just for your family, you can start out a little smaller. So that's one thing that you got to plan for and think about also.
Yeah, and then the last thing is something to do is think about, what are your goals? Where do you want to be in a year, 3 years, or 5 years? You need to make those plans. Like in year one, here's what your very first year, I would suggest starting very small. And if you're going to get chickens, just get a few chickens. Don't get a lot, because
Not
you don't want to
30.
you don't want to get a lot and not like raising chickens. And so start small, and then kind of learn the basics. Learn your land, get used to it. Or even if you're not, you may be in a neighborhood that doesn't have a HOA, and you can do some of these
Yeah.
some of these things. And then by year 2 or 3, you can start adding some more animals, maybe add some more chickens, and then explore what other kind of animals you want to get into. And then, by year 5, which is about what year we're in, year
Mm-hmm.
5, you can start advancing, and you'll look back and see the progress. But the best thing to do is make a plan and, draw it out where you want to be in 5 years. She hates hearing the question at work, where do you want to be in 5 years?
Yes,
But I
I
think
do.
you need to ask yourself, where do you want to be in 5 years? Do you want to be, debt free and more self sufficient? If that's that goal, draw it out on a spreadsheet or a piece
How
of
you're
paper.
going to get there.
Yeah, on how you're going to get there, and the best goals are probably written down. So, that's one of the big things to look at there. So, hopefully this has been helpful to you. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching on the replay. And if you have any other questions about homesteading, or if you're looking at home, if you're already getting started homesteading, let us know what you're doing on that. So we want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We're trying to do this homesteading live stream every weeknight at 7:30 Central. And if you've got a topic you want discussed, just let us know in the chat here below.
And also for tomorrow night, we're gonna do some live canning. So we'd love, we're gonna do some apple jelly. So if you would like to join us and see how kind of simple that can be to just do some jelly from juice, that's what we're gonna be doing. Then join us tomorrow night, and we're gonna be doing that live.
Right, we're gonna we're kind of nervous about doing that live because there's no telling what will turn out, but you'll be able to see exactly what happens in real time, making jelly from fruit juice that you could buy in a store. And it's real easy and it's really fun. And, it's, get a big supply of jelly for you.
Yeah.
So thanks again for joining us. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe and leave your comments. We'll see you back tomorrow.